Okay, so thanks everyone for coming to this little conference. So, in the introduction to Logics of Worlds, Alain Badiou presented a scathing critique of the contemporary regime of capitalo-parliamentarism. According to Badiou, capitalo-parliamentarism is characterized by what he calls democratic materialism. Democratic materialism is a belief that there are only bodies and languages, a belief epitomizing contemporary ideologies of finitude. It reduces human beings to their bodily enjoyment and their petty desires. The democratic materialist doxa transforms humanity to an overstretched vision of animality. Human rights are simply the rights of living of the bios. Such preservation of human rights goes with the preservation of the plurality of living species, of genders, races, and origins. The human animal is identified with the diversity of its species and democratic rights inherent in this diversity. In other words, democratic materialism is a totalizing statement. It is a statement pretending to exhaust all reality by claiming that nothing exists but bodies and languages. It is a statement that does not allow for any exception. To this totality of democratic materialism, Badiou opposed an affirmation of existence of an exception, a gesture of kind of Mallarmian excepté peut-être. He claimed that there are only bodies and languages, except that there are truths. The name of this exception is materialist dialectics. In fact, materialist dialectics is for Badiou the only viable and strategic idea that is able to counter the oppressive power of contemporary capitalo-parliamentarism. In order to combat the capitalo-parliamentarism of today, we shall not return to some form of aristocratic idealism, but we shall find a way to reaffirm dialectics. By dialectics, Badiou understood, following Hegel, I quote, that the essence of all difference is the third term that marks the gap between two others. It is then legitimate to counter democratic materialism, this sovereignty of the two, bodies and languages, with a materialist dialectic, if by materialist dialectic we understand the following statement, in which the three supplements the common reality of the two. There are only bodies and languages, except that there are truths. Note here that Badiou's dialectics does neither abolish the existence of the two, nor merges them into one. It supplements them with a third term, which is an exception from the two. Likewise, Badiou noted elsewhere that, I quote, truths exist as exceptions to what there is, or, another quote, a truth is what insists in exception to the form of there is. Badiou's statement opened the finitude of the two to the infinity of the three. It opened to the not all, or in French, pas tout. There's always more than what there is. Immaterial and infinite truths emerge as exceptions in what there is. In his book for Badiou, Idealism Without Idealism, that was, obviously, besides Badiou's own work, one of the underlying inspiration of our debate within this conference, Frank Ruda highlighted the paradox inherent to Badiou's work by playing with those classical oppositions of materialism and idealism. How come that a materialist as Badiou defends the autonomy of immaterial order of truth? And could not be Badiou's dialectics rather characterized as a kind of, idealism, as you just heard, without classical idealism, if, at least by the latter, we designate a doctrine presupposing the existence of the one, of the whole. And what does the word materialism in fact mean today? Does not the new materialism rather consist in accepting the void, the not all of what there is? And is it not somehow necessary to reverse materialism itself in a materialist way? Rather than about materialism, Badiou himself talked in the Logics of Worlds about the materialist postulate, consisting in a statement that every atom is real. In order to counter the idea that the appearing is rooted in the virtual, Badiou described atoms as the smallest components of being there, as the analytical quilting points of being and appearing, or more precisely, of being and existence. Atoms are the sutures of being to existence. Contemporary physics, by the way, is concerned precisely by looking for those quilting points for what is infinitely big, or what is like the infinite in the infinitesimals, the smallest particles. The materialist statement consists in the assumption that atoms are real, that there is indeed the suture of being and existence, for if atoms were a mere fiction, the whole existence could easily be seen just as a projection of one's subjectivity, and we would fall back into what Quentin Meillassoux denounced as correlationism. In an interview with Tzu Tiantou published in Les Années Rouges, Badiou mentioned that there is, in his own thinking, he understands his own materialism as, I quote, protocols of the formalization of dialectics. If mathematics are ontology for Badiou, because they are the only discourse that we can pronounce on multiplicities of multiplicities that compose being, Badiou reminded us also in a Lacanian way that the real is the impasse of formalization, and that the formalization is necessary only to touch the limits of formalization, to see where we need to decide, because in French we would say ça ne passe pas, it sort of doesn't go through, or it's, the formalization of dialectics is necessary only in order to develop dialectics up to a sufficiently formalized point so that we can see where the impasse is and where the only way out is an axiomatic decision. For Badiou, materialist protocols of formalization of dialectics are necessary only to locate the axiom, to know where we place it. Thus, if we were to talk about Badiou's materialism, maybe we could describe it as materialism of the exception, as a materialism that is not all, for it allows for exception, that means for the existence of truth. It is materialism that allows for the aleatory and unexpected emergence of the event, for the existence of subject who become subject by embodying eternal and infinite truth, which appeared precisely during the event, and the subject then remains faithful to that event, as some of you probably know. We could say that Badiou's philosophical project has been consisting in saving the idealist core of the materialism itself, that means the dialectics. In a sense, Badiou's materialism is, we could say in Marxian way, his materialism is standing on its head. It shows that being materialist without being dialectician can be as rigid and as blind as being a most traditional idealist. Thus, Badiou's own project has been structured by his rethinking of Hegel and by his attempt to save dialectics. Dialectics is, in fact, an important key to his thinking. I have already mentioned that what remained materialist in Badiou's work are protocols of formalization of dialectics that enable us to situate the impasse of the real and its axiomatic solution. Badiou insinuated similar ideas already in his very early texts, such as the 1975 Théorie de la contradiction. This little text depicted the intellectual context in which young Alain Badiou was trying to find his place. Badiou described here the split of his time as a split between the structuralist tendencies and what he called anarcho-desiring conceptions. The structuralist tendencies were unable to account for radical change and for the event, because they, I quote, privileged the becoming which they understood as the diachronical effect of the structures. And structuralist tendencies also constituted a closed systematics. While structuralism focused on analysis of shifts of given terms, the underlying structure of exchange remained intact. These tendencies were sometimes associated in early Badiou texts with thinking of Louis Althusser, to whom he reproached precisely for not being dialectician enough. Although Badiou characterized Althusser's materialism as being relatively progressist, in the 1970s he strongly criticized its lack of negation and of dialectics. Unlike Althusser, Badiou believed that it was necessary to maintain the category of the subject as well as dialectics in order to combat capitalism. On the other hand, Badiou described in Theory of the Contradiction the other pole of the intellectual field of his time as so-called anarcho-desiring conception. And the ultimate goal of this anarcho-desiring conception was a kind of dissolution of all structures. This conception constituted for him only a reverse of the other structurist extreme. Badiou fustigated obviously Gilles Deleuze, Jean-François Lyotard, and any thinking that would reduce everything to la dérive, le hors-place, sort of subversion and the universal destruction of any place of domination. Already in the early Theory of the Contradiction, Badiou attempted to dialecticize the dialectics itself. I quote, "In order to be dialectician, it means not to be mechanicist, it is also necessary to acknowledge the negation of this fixity. Materialism is what structures the contradiction by fixing strategically the place of its terms. Dialectics is what contradicts the structure by thinking the inversion of places, the non-fixity of the allocation of terms. If, on the one hand, materialism formalizes dialectics in order to locate its own limits, its own impasse, on the other hand, dialectics abolishes the structure by changing the allocation of its terms. Thus, we could say that Badiou's goal has been since then to dialecticize the relationship between formalism and dialectics as such. This project could be seen as underlying assumption of rethinking of Hegel, which has been appearing in the most of Badiou's philosophical treatises. In the interview with Suciento, Badiou mentioned that, I quote, Hegel did not arrive to find a true dialectical point of the relationship between dialectics and formalism. Finally, his own speculative formalism swallows up dialectics rather than demonstrates it, end of quote. In a sense, Badiou saw Hegel as someone who de-dialecticized dialectics. And he was convinced that the relationship between formalism and dialectics has direct political consequences. For it is precisely our failure to resolve the relationship between dialectics and formalism of political party that led, according to Badiou, to the failure of communist experiments around the world. In our time, the anti-dialectical Stalinist formalism was simply replaced by a similarly anti-dialectical anarchy of capital parliamentarism. In order to re-dialecticize dialectics, Badiou needed to go through a contemporary Hegelian, which is Jacques Lacan. Jacques Lacan himself often criticized philosophy for being trapped within a so-called master's discourse. In Lacan's view, philosophy, by positing the existence of the one or the whole, remained unable to grasp the real. Yet, such a conception of philosophy is in a stark contradiction with Badiou's own philosophical project, for Badiou's goal is precisely to show that philosophy cannot be reduced to its internal temptation of positing the existence of the one. Contrariwise, Badiou proves that there can be a philosophy for which the one would inexist and which would be able to grasp the real. Philosophy, by responding critically to objections of psychoanalysis, can affirm that the one exists only as the result of a constructive count, of the count as one. In other words, philosophy can suture itself to the immanent multiplicity of the real. And it is this very stitching of the philosophy and the real, the stitching of the philosophy and the not all, that constitutes one of many dialectical tensions internal to Badiou's thinking. For this reason, Badiou has been interested primarily in Lacan's late writings of 1970s, in which Lacan frequently referred to set theory. In his seminar Ou Pire, given between 1971 and 1972, Lacan posited that the one does not exist. According to Lacan, the one does not exist, there is one, or he says, y a de l'un. And I could quote, again, in my very probably bad translation of Lacan, Lacan says, I was not doing thinking of the one, but thinking starting from the statement that there is one, or y a de l'un. I was taking it to the conclusion that was demonstrating its use in order to make psychoanalysis from that, or in French, Au reste, je ne faisais pas penser de l'un, mais à partir du dire qu'il y a de l'un, j'allais au terme que démontre son usage pour en faire psychanalyse. So, Lacan was convinced that the existence of the one is purely imaginary. The one is located at the place of the semblant, and the philosopher is someone who, in his wordplay, who soupire à l'un. But what exactly is the difference between saying that the one exists and that there is one? In Upir, Lacan referred to set theory, in which a set with only one element still can be considered as set, because according to Zermelo-Franco's axiom of regularity, no set can be an element of itself. In set theory, the one appears as singleton, that means as a set that has exactly one element, and the singleton can be also the set consisting of an empty set as its only element. So this example from the set theory led Lacan to a deduction that, again, very bad translation, one begins at the level where one is missing. What he says in French is « l'un commence au niveau où il y en a un qui manque ». It led him to a deduction that the one is precisely the singleton of a set containing an empty set. The one is a set containing the void, and it is by counting this void that we can affirm that the one inexists. Thus, the one has no positive immanent existence as such. It emerges as an effect of the lack. The one is an effect of a count. So when in Upir, Lacan affirmed that the one does not exist, but there is one, he referred precisely to this constructive vision of the one as a result of the count. In Being an Event, Badiou clearly states that the one does not exist. I quote, "The one which is not solely exists as operation. In other words, there is no one, only the count is one." The existence of the one is the key aspect of Badiou's, the inexistence of the one is the key aspect of Badiou's ontology. For Badiou, there is only a count as one. Everything that is presented presents itself as multiplicity. The one is a mere result of mathematical operations. It has no immanent existence as such. The one is always a result of a count. In Badiou's thinking, the one is also stitched to the void. The structure is, I quote, "what prescribes for a presented multiple the regime of its count as one," end of quote. Being is composed of inconsistent and infinite multiplicities, and ontology is thinking of these multiplicities qua multiplicities. But if these multiplicities are inconsistent, it means also that they cannot be described by language, for any language would count them as one. That means the language would abolish the multiplicity. So while Lacan's reductionist point of view actually circumscribed philosophy to the existence of the one, Badiou proves that there can be indeed a philosophy without the one, that there can be a philosophy of yad l'un. Badiou's philosophy does not foreclose the real, and it is this very stitching of the philosophy to the real that could be interpreted as the materialist core of Badiou's thinking. One of key dialectical tensions internal to Badiou's thinking is a tension between inconsistent multiplicities and the count as one. Badiou would probably, or maybe Badiou would actually describe Lacan's own attempt to create what he called non-unifying thinking as another kind of anarcho-desiring conception. We cannot simply abolish the count as one, for we would fall precisely in a primordial and profoundly anti-dialectical anarchism. Thinking needs the one, it needs the count as one. Without the one, thinking would become a mere ontological inconsistency. In his seminar on Lacan, Badiou affirmed that, I quote, "a thinking that is not unifying is not for me even a thinking, at least if by thinking, once more, we understand something that, in an active process, is unifying theory and practice. Without the count as one, thinking would be voided and relegated to intricacies of intuitionist logics that ignores the principle of non-contradiction. In a sense, thinking that is pas tout, or not all, is not thinking at all. Since it is impossible to describe inconsistent and infinite multiplicities, The axiom operates a scission within inconsistency. It separates apart from this inconsistency and counts it as one. Badiou's axiom does not abolish the inconsistency. It acknowledges that it is logically impossible to make all multiplicities consistent, to make them belong to a set. There will always be excess, a leftover of the inconsistency over consistency. But thinking, by precisely being axiomatic, can expand its domain by separating larger and larger multiplicities from the sphere of the inconsistency. Thus, this very movement of thought embodies dialectics between the consistency and inconsistency. In this very movement, the two, constituted by the multiple and the one, is supplemented by a third term, which is the axiom, or the count as one. Thus, we could say that in order to be materialists today, we need to first start by asking how to be dialecticians. There is nothing that would be per se forbidden to thinking. Thinking can know the thing in itself. It can know also the infinite and inconsistent multiplicities of being. If thinking cannot exhaust those inconsistent multiplicities, it can still operate in a dialectic way and progressively separate bigger and bigger parts from them and count them as one. Our thinking cannot be prescribed by what there is. We have a right and a capacity to think more than what there is, to ask for the impossible, as les 68 arts maybe would say, demandons l'impossible. And Badiou's own philosophical system departs from exceptions, such as truths or events, not from what there is. In the interview with Tzu that I have already mentioned, Badiou precisely affirmed that it is dialectics that is the entry point to materialism, and that we enter materialism through dialectics. According to Badiou, an inverse endeavor, that means trying to enter dialectics through materialism, would, I quote, always fail because it is unable to give itself the concept of the matter. Thus, in order to be truly contemporary materialists today, maybe we shall start by asking how to save the spiritual core of any materialism, that means the dialectics.